Если вы не знаете Rusglish, then don't come here. To make things worse, you don't even know whether you would have to use this weird combination, and sometimes you actually have to ask который человек, что говорил, whether he knows or she knows this combination. Although the smarter ones, when they see you're a foreigner, they approach you to practice their English. So about Rusglish and slow transition to liberalization is what I'm going to talk to you a little bit from Tashkent. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative on this impromptu video, which I have no idea how the frame will look like. It's recorded in dire conditions, but it is what it is. You know the drill. If you're watching this, I'm probably in another country. The internet in Uzbekistan is still far from catching up with the rest of the world. It's just essentially impossible to publish a video from this country. No wonder there is not much about Uzbekistan on YouTube, because publishing videos on YouTube other than maybe 360p is impossible. So I was talking in the beginning about Rusglish. The thing is as follows. There are several other countries that have changed their main language in recent history, most recently being, I think, Rwanda, which transitioned from French being the official language of the country to English. So as a result, you still have a lot of well, Franglish in public. I believe it's called Creole French or Creole English, but something like this can be done with the second language of the country too. In Uzbekistan, of course, as long as the Soviet Union existed, and for at least another decade and a half, maybe 2 decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian was, of course, the second language and the language of business. But over the last several years, English has been heavily promoted, and now the country is in transition for their second language from Russian to English. But as many others have noticed, many others in the former Soviet Union, Ukraine being prime example, but not just Ukraine, Georgia as well, it's kind of difficult transitioning away from English to Russian, sorry, the other way around, from Russian to English is quite difficult. And in the period in between those two moments, you get a lot of these kinds of honks that I introduced in the beginning of this video. And this little sujuk, this little combination between Russian and English, of course, craps all over the basic grammar rules of both Russian and English. But okay, Rusglish notwithstanding, there's more to this country than I expected. As someone in the donor circle was noticing, by the time I get back to Europe, probably the Gulag part of this tour will pale in comparison to the stories I've gathered in about 2 weeks in Uzbekistan. And it's probably true. After the death of the first president, everyone expected at the very least that the second president will be not so bad. And he delivered on that. He didn't deliver on many others, and of course I'll go into a lot of details once I get back to Europe. Maybe in downtown Tashkent, across the street from the Ministry of Internal Affairs, is probably not the best place to discuss this. But in addition to him delivering on that first promise, whether it was intentional or it just so happened, not just the regime but the country as a whole, and especially the economy of Uzbekistan, is discovering the value of leaving people alone. Again, I don't know whether it was intentional or not. I will know in a few days, but as of the moment of this recording, I don't know. But essentially the regime said, okay, we cannot can go on like that. We cannot go on like the times of the first president, and we cannot just keep the lid on everything, so we'll just withdraw. And and what about us, said the people most loyal to the regime, and said, well, y'all gonna handle it. And the majority of the population agreed and started taking advantage of these opportunities. Now, of course, the most visible part of that is, of course, the tourism industry, more or less non-existent before 2017. But it's not the most important part. It's not the most important development. The most important development is on the streets of the cities of Uzbekistan. Entire new neighborhoods, mostly built by European companies, although some of them by Russians as well. Entire new industries that simply did not exist just 5 years ago. But also you see it in these kinds of, I hope I got them on the camera, in these kinds of deprecated checkpoints. There used to be checkpoints in North Korea style, and all sorts of checkpoints where the state would physically keep tabs on everyone. The kind of surveillance state in a very dystopian sense. And all of those have just simply been abandoned. There's just nobody there, nobody cares anymore, and they're just slowly they're decaying as a reminder of what this place used to be merely 5, 6, 7 years ago. And that's the most important development, because once you no longer have to file a report essentially on everything you have to do, that's when things, that's when the magic happens. It's the magic of freedom essentially. And that is the part that the population enjoys the most. Now, of course, if you go deeper a little bit, you will also find, of course, a lot of discontent. And this is something that I don't know whether the current regime knows or not, or expects or not. But this happened in every country that came out of totalitarianism. So I guess Uzbekistan is trying to come out of it in an orderly fashion. Unfortunately for the regime, that's just not possible. It will have to involve some disorder. And you've read in the media earlier in July, there was some disorder in the far west of the country, in where the Karakalpak people live. Now that's just the beginning. Protests are still very rare in Uzbekistan, but they're much more often. I mean, over the last 5 years, there were more protests than in the previous 25 years. So, and it's going to get a lot more. I'm not going to say messy necessarily. The level of random violence in this country is very low, even when it would be possible. But it's going to get more disorderly for sure, because sooner or later people are going to start asking questions, such as, for instance, and that's one of the questions that it's slowly coming up more and more often. And the first president and the current president, they try to address it, but they're not addressing it good enough. For instance, what exactly is our history? So when I will be making videos when I get back to Europe about the history of Uzbekistan, it may indeed be one of the documents, because this country doesn't have a history, a written history, a coherent, internally consistent, and also consistent with outside documents, and what doesn't have any sort of history, either approved or not, because because the Soviet Union, that's why. And not just the Soviet Union, but also the Tsarist Empire, because that's another thing. One of the many reasons there is this slow transition from Russian to English is because this place has been under Russian influence or under Russian control for much longer than the Soviet Union had been around. And let's just say that things did not did not get down quite well. Let's put it this way. Things didn't work out. For instance, there's plenty of elements of the more ancient, well, not ancient, but older history of Uzbekistan that somehow managed to survive 10 or 12 or 13 or 14 centuries, and then the Russians came around, and some of them ended up being destroyed, either partially or totally, which means the elements of Uzbekistan's history essentially have been lost forever because of the Russians. So there's that. It's also worth noting that the COVID so-called crisis triggered liberalization in this country rather than a march towards a more authoritarian type of society. And this is notable because it's, well, I don't know if it's the only example. It's not the only example. Egypt is another example, but it's the most noteworthy example over the last 3 years for sure. So for instance, during 2020, in the autumn of the year 2020, the state here was offering $3,000 as a reparation, essentially, to any visitor who could prove that he or she contracted COVID-19 from Uzbekistan. Of course, there were several attempted claims at this prize. There is no known successful claim. Why? Because, well, essentially they're like, okay, the rest of the world is shutting down, and now we're not going to do that because, well, we've just opened up as a country, and we're just gonna have to continue opening up. So as a result, well, if everyone around us is shutting down, how about we draw in all of those visitors who happen to be around and don't want to spend weeks and weeks and months on end in a closed room being afraid of a cough. So they had that program going on for a while, and it worked out. It saved the tourism industry, and also it kept the country on the map while everyone else was cowering down. Let's not forget, China is not far away from here, so it was quite a ballsy move for the leadership here to resist the pressure from the two giants around, namely Russia and China, of course. Then there is the difference that I noticed, at least compared to Kazakhstan. Now, Kazakhstan is more integrated with the rest of the world, more global, if you want, more globalized, I guess. Uzbekistan, not so much. I mean, you can see, for instance, here's footage that I've taken in a shopping mall. This is their latest movies at the cinema in the mall. And this particular footage you're looking at is taken on August the 8th, 2022. So you can look up on the internet how old those movies were at the moment of that recording. So the country is not really that well connected with the rest of the world. It just recently connected its banking, for instance, and not all of the banks. Most of the banks are still not connected with the rest of the world. With that aspect notwithstanding, their desire is much bigger than in Kazakhstan, right? In Kazakhstan, you can even see random Kazakh people talking in Russian with each other. That just never happens here, never. Whereas here, you will also see a lot of European businesses. I was even joking with an acquaintance that in Kazakhstan they'd be like, we want to be in Europe, whereas in Uzbekistan we want to be Europe. There's more European style business here than in the northern neighbor. Now, admittedly, this can also be explained through the fact that it's a much larger, it has a larger population. It's not as sparsely populated as the northern neighbors. Kazakhstan is easy to find on the map because it has a large surface, but population-wise is about the size of Romania, whereas this country is, of course, much bigger, almost the size of Poland, and with a very high total fertility rate, so it's gonna outpace Poland population-wise relatively soon. So maybe it's because of that. Of course, in addition to the slow opening up economically, it's going to be a slow opening up culturally, and it will also start with other questions. So the bigger question is, what is our history? Then it will be, of course, what about things like minority rights and, yes, freedom of speech. And that's going to be complicated. At this point, you feel the censorship online in particular, because the internet is very slow, and the part of that is by design. The regime censors, for instance, Twitter is routinely blocked in this country, although Twitter is not the only example. So at this point, it's going to take some time until things open up, but when they do, they will start asking things like asking for stuff like freedom of speech and minority rights, because this country also has well, 3 regions essentially. Most of the rest of the world has already heard about the Far West, the Karakalpak people, or Karakalpakstan, which also has a special status in the constitution of the country. And then there's of course the middle of it. I've mostly been through the middle of it, which is Uzbekistan, or mostly the Uzbek people live. And then there's the Far East, which is part of the Uzbekistan Republic, but is mostly inhabited by by Turkic people, and is referred to locally as Turkestan. Now, unfortunately, the eastern part also generated a movement that is on various terrorist lists of both the west and the east. So, it's a very complicated story. I'll try to go through as much of it as possible when I get back to Europe, because again, the internet in this area is generally speaking pretty slow. I mean, of course, in Kazakhstan and in Kyrgyzstan is not really censored, and it's slightly faster than here, but not by much. So, publishing videos from this area, especially while always being on the trip, is a bit complicated. But with that, I'll have to say that this Uzbekistan delivered more than I expected. There were things that I expected to find here, and I did. There were things that I expected to find and I didn't, such as more legacies of the personality cult. I had read that they abolished it, but as I've mentioned in the previous video, they abolished it quietly, and it's rarer and rarer and rarer as time goes on, and they don't make a big fuss about it. It's just gone. And there were things that I did not expect to find, and I did, such as, for instance, that kind of naivete that was quite common in the Intermarium in early 90s. So, for instance, I was stopped multiple times by especially late teenagers, early 20-somethings, especially essentially approaching me in English. Excuse me, sir, do you speak English? Yes, I do. Do you have some time so I can practice my English? What do you like about our country? What does it suck? What not? And just basically waiting for a small conversation, generally about their country, although not necessarily. One of them wanted to talk about Romanian football, but just for them to practice their English, which is something that you would see routinely in the early 1990s, and sometimes in the late 1980s in the Intermarium. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, essentially. So whilst there have been added multiple elements of modernity, and especially the capital city Tashkent is in the process of heavy modernization. As you can see, for instance, this little park here, it's going to be essentially Singapore kind of a place, and there's multiple places in the country where construction work is taking place, and most of it in good taste. And at this pace, if they can manage to keep the income coming into this country, you will see, especially this city, Tashkent, you'll see it in the news in the 4 or 5 or 6 years from now, when it will become more important. It will put itself on the map somehow. Maybe as a fiscal paradise like Singapore, maybe as definitely not as a tourist attraction. Tashkent is not exactly a tourist attraction. It's very difficult to navigate. The maps are borked. Even the maps that you buy at the bookstore, which is what I always do. I don't use Google Maps or whatever. I don't even have a smartphone. But even the maps that you book, if you buy them at the bookstore, they're somehow borked. Some of the roads no longer exist, or they're called a different way, and the names of the streets in the city change routinely. Not so in the rest of the cities. In the rest of the cities, they remain rather constant. But it's still difficult to navigate, and they still have these, as you can see them in the footage, they have these big streets and there's no pedestrian crossing for like 2 or 3 or 4 kilometers, and for at 49 degrees Celsius, and it's not exactly fun. So some of these things will have to change, and I've seen that the more recently developed places and parts of this town and places in other cities of Uzbekistan have taken this into consideration, and they're more easy to navigate. So Tashkent probably will not be a tourist attraction in itself anytime soon, but it can be a business attraction, it can be a combination of the two, it can be a leisure attraction. There are ways to put it on the map, and it seems that at this point both the private sector and the state is trying everything, essentially, see what it works. Thing is that I'm taping this 3 hours before my bus leaves to get out of Uzbekistan. I think that by the time I publish the stories from Uzbekistan, it will be one of those moments where I present the news before it's news. At this pace, again, in 3 or 4 or 5 years, this place will be in the news much more often than it has been in the previous 30 years, essentially. So, yeah. Well, I mentioned Rusglish, I mentioned liberalization. What else? Oh yeah, but don't come here during summertime. Like, seriously, don't. The sun will kill you. During summertime, life essentially starts at 4:30 or 5 p.m. And it stops at 2 a.m. essentially, and between 2 a.m. and 10 a.m. there's nobody on the streets. You get a chance to videotape empty streets, of course. Nobody tells you not to go out, but you just shouldn't, because well, early in the morning is nothing works, and then things start working, but it's just too hot for flourishing human life. During the winter time, winters are much milder than most of Europe. According to the locals, about -10 degrees Celsius, which is not so bad. Not so bad. There are places in Europe with much harsher winters, for sure. Oh yes, someone asked me, why am I wearing this cap? Doesn't it glow in the dark? Someone asked in the public group. Well, yes, but then again, look at my face. I cannot pass as an Asian, so I can't really pass as a local. Maybe I can pass as a Russian, I guess, but why would I want that? I mean, it's not a good time to pass as a Russian. And besides, it spares you a lot of unwanted conversation. People in this country and in Kyrgyzstan as well, they tend to essentially randomly ask you where you're from, and I can just point to the, yeah, from here, just leave me alone. It's definitely not, at least in this aspect, is very different from Europe. In Europe, it would be considered quite impolite to just randomly approach people and ask them where they're from. And the answer, of course, would be none of your goddamn business. But here, it's impolite to reply none of your goddamn business. So, it just shortens unwanted conversation and lengthens wanted conversations, such as, for instance, with the train conductor from the night train that I managed to catch from Bukhara back to Tashkent. Speaking of which, the train system is much less dysfunctional here than it is in Kazakhstan, which is precisely why I left Kazakhstan and came here. And basically, I'll get to the Gulag towards the end of the tour, because that's the only way I could get tickets. Don't get me started on that. All right, it's going to be almost another month until I get back to Europe. That's for sure. In this night, when I'm taping this, I'm taking a long bus, a long marsrutka line to Bishkek, and let's see what Kyrgyzstan has to offer. Keep shekel if you like what we do, and see you around. There's going to be a lot of stories from Central Asia by the end of this year, as soon as I get back to Europe, essentially. Yeah, cheers.